it water with the sheep in the box?
Section 28 of the Local Government Act of 1988 read as follows. 2A. Prohibition on promoting homosexuality by teaching or by publishing material. 1. A local authority shall not A. Intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality. B. Promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. 2. Nothing in subsection 1 above shall be taken to prohibit the doing of anything for the purpose of treating or preventing the spread of disease. 3. In any proceedings in connection with the application of this section, a court shall draw such inferences as to the intention of the local authority as may be reasonably drawn from the evidence before it. Section 28 was a piece of legislation passed in 1988 and only repealed in 2003 that made it illegal to acknowledge or promote homosexuality or homosexual relationships as in any way equal or similar to heterosexual ones in many situations, and especially in schools or where children might see it. It was a large part of Margaret Thatcher's legacy and essentially kicked off a huge part of the British gay rights movement, including the formation of Stonewall, as well as numerous protests, a vigorous gay liberation movement, and sadly, a lot of suffering for young gay teens who had to grow up in a society that treated them as second-class citizens, dangerous by their very existence, and hatred of them and the people they loved was not only widespread amongst the general populace, but essentially sanctioned by the government and those who supposedly existed to carry out the will of the people. I think it's important to remember and invoke the memory of Section 28 because its legacy lives on. In fact, as recently as 2017, we had a Prime Minister who once said that she thought most parents want the comfort of knowing Section 28 is there, and much like fearmongering over black men became fearmongering over gay men as the primary target of acceptable bigotry in the 80s, that same rhetoric is now being employed against trans people, especially trans women, often using gay women as an imagined victim of these apparently predatory trans people, despite just a few years ago being up in arms about the idea of those same gay women being allowed to marry their partners, as many prominent gender critical, which is the gender equivalent of race realist in case you weren't aware, MPs actively voted against the legalization of gay marriage in 2014 and justify their treatment of trans people with faux concern. Before we move on, I just want to state that the purpose of this video is not to debunk the arguments or talking points I'll be discussing in any amount of depth, partly because they're not really worth the time and effort and are plainly self-evidently bullshit, but also because I have previously made a video doing exactly that, going through common turf arguments and debunking them, and I don't really want to repeat myself here. What this video exists to do is point out the similarities in both rhetoric and legislation regarding the gay rights movement of the 80s and 90s, and the trans rights movement currently fighting for equal rights now. What I want to do with this video is twofold. First, I want to show that whilst the targets of bigotry and recipients of the abuse it inspires may change, though obviously things like racism and homophobia do still exist, just less prevalently than, say, the 60s or the 80s, the tactics, the rhetoric, and above all, the hatred simply don't. And secondly, I want to highlight the shared oppression the LGBTQ+ community suffers and why we need to work together to fight against it, as if our shared history and struggles were not proof enough. There are definitely those in the community who would oppose this, insist on LGB without the T or whatever, like this individual, a gay woman, who decided that trans people wanting rights made her hate the rainbow flag, apparently not being aware of the role played by trans people in, for example, the Stonewall riots, but ultimately this is a self-defeating point of view because when it comes down to it, our struggle is a shared one. We cannot allow another Section 28 to come along and do to trans people what the original did to LGB people. And make no mistake, the government, which holds a majority in Parliament, is full of transphobes and old-school Thatcherite homophobes, many of whom have openly admitted to wanting a reinstatement of the original Section 28. Our current Prime Minister referred to gay men as tank-top-wearing bum boys, and the opposition, which ideally is supposed to, oppose the government, is riddled with TERFs. The chances of a proposed trans version of Section 28 being passed is honestly not as unlikely as you may think, and there are currently a lot of rumblings around the ECHR 2010 Equality Act and Gender Recognition Act, now out of the EU, and indeed it looks like the UK may be getting its own version of a bathroom bill in the near future. And there is no longer any need to be beholden to, for example, many European laws regarding civil rights. Other countries have already started accepting British trans people's asylum on the grounds of LGBTQ+ persecution, such is the problem. As activists, we need to be aware of this and prepare to resist it. Let's go through a few of the more glaring similarities, shall we?
There's no nudes in gay news, our last magazine, but they still find excuses to call it obscene. Read how disgusting we are in the press, the evening news and the Sunday Express. Molesters of children, corrupters of youth, it's there in the paper, it must be the truth.
Part of any hate movement is the demonisation and portrayal of the outgroup as a horde of sexual deviants and potential predators. This was of course done to black men throughout much of the 20th century. Back in the 80s it was absolutely done to gay people, though especially gay men, and as a result often gay men were excluded from traditionally male spaces because they were either abused or else there was a fearmongering about their potential as an abuser. I mean, homosexuality was categorised as a mental disorder until 1973, for fuck's sake. And let's not forget the many queer-coded or explicitly queer villains in cinema throughout most of the 80s. There's always been a kind of fear of gay men in locker rooms, though, because the supposed victims of being looked at by another dude in the gym are other men. Usually there isn't quite so much of a fearmongering over the potential of a sexual assault because, well, in our society we kind of just see that as something that happens to women, right? This is something we as feminists should of course be resisting, but TERFs are often not very good at the whole feminism thing. In fact, it was often lesbians who were the focus of much of the old school fearmongering about locker rooms, as you can see from newspaper articles like this, and letters to the editor like this one. I point this out because I find it so fascinating, and to be honest, very depressing, that some of the most virulent TERFs and gender-critical feminists these days are cis gay women who seem to have forgotten that the rhetoric they're using against trans women is the same as that which would have been thrown at them a few decades ago, and the same logic applies. Lesbians and trans women have been using female facilities for as long as there have been gendered facilities in the first place, with no issue whatsoever, until the fearmongering and campaigns of hatred started up. As Stonewall put it, for many years trans people have been using single-sex services that match their gender without issue, and this should not change. And then you have the weird stuff around TERF's claims of always being able to tell, and the weird memes about trans women being manly or something, which is funny because often if trans women are very feminine, they're also attacked for that because they're making a mockery of womanhood. The rhetoric is designed to stop them having any way of existing without receiving abuse, which harms not only women in general, but specifically the great strides the LGBTQ+ community has made in breaking down those stereotypes and barriers to entry for example, womanhood. There are entire communities of feminine gay men, butch lesbians, and so on, but by this logic, these people who have been integral to the movement since day one are now being dismissed and ignored because, you see, if a woman is perceived to be especially masculine, they're not a real woman, and so on and so forth. This is of course completely contradictory because transphobes often accuse trans men of being confused gender non-conforming lesbians, like J.K. Rowling explicitly did in her TERF Wars article. If you shame anyone for not matching up to what you reckon their gender expression should be based on their birth sex, then by implication you are telling gender non-conforming people that you do not and have never supported them or their struggles. Gay men and lesbians have suffered for decades for their sexuality being seen as not matching up with their gender. For example, often gay men are seen as unmanly and vice versa for lesbians, and all this essentialism does is undo decades of activism. No, you see, feminine men are just confused women, and masculine women are male predators, etc. Sure, once they find out their actual genders, or gender assigned at birth, this would be immediately taken back, but they make most of these assumptions on presentation and appearance alone, so they're going to get caught out one way or another. Trans women may seek to enter women's spaces because they are women and are treated as women. Trans women are blocked from accessing various resources reserved for cis men. They are likely to find that women's spaces fit them better than men's spaces, and they experience misogyny and gendered violence, so things like women's refuges and women's support groups may be necessary for them. However, the term single-sex spaces has come into usage rooted in anti-trans activism as part of a movement to lock down the boundaries of women's spaces in a way that defines them by their assigned sex at birth, not by gender, therefore excluding trans women. A single-sex space is not quite the same thing as a women's space because, in practice, the vast majority of women's spaces are gendered, not sexed. An exhaustive bodily examination and/or chromosomal scan will not be performed on attendees to a Woman in Engineering event, for example. Those who attend do so because they have self-selected as belonging to the category woman. They've been positively identified as women by others, they present as women, etc. We'll talk about this a little later on when we talk about the weird stuff about trans kids, but I think it's important to note here the similarities between the portrayal of trans women as predators acting like women to get close to and attack the vulnerable, and the very similar fear-mongering about gay men as hypersexual beings of potential sexual violence in the not-too-distant past. In fact, there was a common belief that allowing gay teachers in schools would somehow lead to mass child molestation, which is an idea that's still supported today by such organisations as the LGBT Alliance, because posting homophobia to own the trans rights activists is some kind of 4D chess move now, I guess. Just like how there's currently an ongoing fear-mongering campaign regarding trans women in women's locker rooms where small children might also be. It's really rather on the nose here, because Section 28 literally existed to suppress gays in school, implying that they're predators or seek to convert, just like transphobes claim is the case with trans people nowadays, but more on this later. Here are a few statements from the Stonewall Report, which interviewed various professionals who coordinate domestic violence support. Domestic and sexual violence services in England and Wales have been supporting trans women in their single-sex women-only services for some time. While respondents were aware of a view that gender recognition reform could allow violent men to pose as women to access their services, with one participant expressing a concern about this, there was otherwise a clear consensus that services' thorough risk assessment procedures would safeguard against this. These participants said that gender recognition reform would not compromise their ability to protect their service against or turn away any abusive or disruptive individual. Several participants expressed concern that there are trans survivors who are being let down when seeking support, with some likening their experiences to the struggles faced by many Black, Asian and minority ethnic (BAME) women, lesbians, bi women and disabled women seeking support. Participants said that funding cuts are the main threat facing their services and called for increased funding for all services, including women-only services, specialist services for LGBT survivors, and services for BAME women. The actual experts in this field, who are speaking from experience rather than a pre-existing transphobic view of trans women as fetishists and narcissists, say that trans-inclusive policies would not affect them identifying and turning away abusive individuals. The abusive man who cannot be challenged due to GRA reforms is a myth. The at-risk trans woman who needs a refuge, by contrast, is an everyday reality, and those who see at-risk trans women's safety as far less important than chasing a boogeyman should not be given any influence over our country's domestic violence services.
Have you heard the story about Peter Wells, who one day got arrested and dragged to the cells for being in love with a guy of 18? The vicar found out they'd been having a scene. The magistrate sent him for trial by the Crown. He even appealed, but they still sent him down. He was only mistreated a couple of years, 'cause even in prison they look after the queers.
There's a fascinating tendency for TERFs, gender-critical people, whatever you want to call them, to both deny the science and also lean heavily on it when it suits them personally. For example, they will deny the medical consensus that trans people are valid and that gender is not the same thing as sex, or that puberty blockers are basically harmless and have been used for literally decades on cis children, but try to claim that actually the science is on their side because chromosomes, or even occasionally some kind of wild conspiracy in which the trans rights activists in some way got to the scientists, putting pressure on them to come to incorrect conclusions to support their insidious agenda, and apparently have done for almost 100 years at this point. In much the same way as the anti-gay rights movement throughout much of the 20th century claimed that homosexuality was unnatural or in some way due to teens being tricked into being gay, just like the narrative about trans people, especially trans men, that we've become familiar with recently, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence showing the contrary. We'll go into a little more detail on this when we talk about the rebranding and resurgence of conversion therapy later, but it is worth noting because science denial is and always has been a feature of bigotry. Just take a look at the racist 1350 arguments used against black people for a further example. That's actually quite an apt comparison because much like that dog whistle, transphobes like to take statistics out of context all the time. Ever heard the 40% number? It's basically just a statement of fact that, in general, trans people are more susceptible to suicide and mental health issues than the general population. Now, the obvious response here, from a rational person anyway, is to simply ask why that is, and then explore the potential explanations. Studies have shown that the two main causes are dysphoria and the treatment trans people often suffer in our society, incidentally. The bigots' response is to jump to wild conclusions like black people are inherently predisposed to criminal activity, or trans people are unhappy with their transition and are naturally mentally ill, or AIDS is a gay disease and shows that those gays are immoral and sexually promiscuous perverts. To bring the subject of this video back to section 28, regardless of any actual evidence, because it's not about finding the truth, it's about pushing a hateful agenda. Honestly, the similarities between the AIDS crisis and the nightmare that is trans healthcare right now are shocking, especially considering that so many TERFs are either gay or claim to be gay allies. We see the same arguments along with the same dehumanization and speculation as to the deserving nature of it, not to mention the deliberate harm and reluctance to help on the part of the powers that be. We can see the similarities really very clearly. The reluctance to accept that it was a serious problem, the distancing from those in power for PR reasons, the idea that raising awareness or even acknowledging the issue is in some way encouragement or disturbing young minds, and so on and so forth. Not to mention the deliberate underfunding and deprioritization of LGBTQ plus healthcare in both cases, both by underfunding and not really caring too much about it, or by deliberately making it as difficult as possible to access these services in the name of protecting the people who are dying as a result of this stalling tactic, because hey, a dead teenager is better than a trans teenager, right? Downing Street's initial instinct was to shy away from the subject of AIDS. Mark Addison, Thatcher's private secretary, advised against her participating in the opening ceremony for a £30 million blood screening laboratory in Elstree, Hertfordshire. My own feeling is that the Prime Minister should steer clear of AIDS, even when it is a question of opening laboratories to help innocent victims, he wrote. I think this is all something for Northern Fowler, the health secretary. If she's going to do a medical visit, I should prefer to suggest a hospital or a home for children with incurable diseases, etc. Fowler submitted a memorandum detailing plans to publish explicit health warnings in large advertisements in the Sunday papers. In her trademark blue felt pen annotations, Thatcher expressed alarm. Do we have to do the section on risky sex? I should have thought it should do immense harm if young teenagers were to read it, which in my opinion seems rather concerningly similar to recent comments made by Liz Truss regarding the Gender Recognition Act, following a laughably named Women and Equality Select Committee last year, which was chaired by an MP who voted against marriage equality, incidentally, regarding the apparently essential three principles in the government's reform of trans rights. First of all, the protection of single-sex spaces, which is extremely important. Second, making sure that transgender adults are free to live their lives as they wish without fear of persecution, while maintaining the proper checks and balances in the system. Finally, which is not a direct issue concerning the Gender Recognition Act, but is relevant, making sure that the under 18s are protected from decisions they could make that are irreversible in the future. I believe strongly that adults should have the freedom to lead their lives as they see fit, but I think it's very important that while people are still developing their decision-making capabilities, that we protect them from making these irreversible decisions. The idea is that failing to take action that may help LGBTQ plus people may cause tremendous damage and cause them to die off in droves, but if just one cishet kid is at even a tiny risk of suffering even a fraction of the prejudice of harm suffered by that community, then that's too high a risk to take, and all those gays will just have to die, I guess. And this is from the government that did more to harm kids than any in recent memory, so let's not pretend that the fear-mongering about child safety is any more than a convenient excuse to kill vulnerable people and groups.
And sit back and watch as they close down our clubs, arrest us for meeting and raid all our pubs. Make sure your boyfriend's at least 21. And if you're a lesbian, don't be a mum. Lie to your workmates, lie to your folks. Put down the queens and tell anti-queer jokes. Gay lips ridiculous, join their laughter. The buggers are legal now. What more are they after?
You may be confused on this point. After all, doesn't the UK have legal gay marriage? Well, yes, technically gay marriage has been allowed to exist since 2014, so regardless of how the government views trans people as their assigned gender at birth or their actual gender, they can get married to whoever they please. The issue is not with getting married, it's remaining married. Allow me to explain. In England and Wales, prior to 2014, a married trans person would need their spouse's permission to obtain a gender recognition certificate, which is something we have in the UK that allows you to change your gender on official documents, basically, and in some cases would simply annul the marriage because technically that would have created a small number of same-gender marriages. However, the legalisation of gay marriage didn't restore any of the marriages of trans people that were forcibly annulled as a precondition for them securing a GRC, and as of right now, a GRC will not be issued unless the spouse of the transgender person has consented, essentially meaning that a trans person has to choose between their marriage and their gender identity a lot of the time, because if their spouse doesn't consent, legally, the marriage has to be terminated before a GRC can be issued, meaning that in a potentially abusive situation, that could be used as a weapon and a bargaining chip. As Baroness Barker summarised it in 2019, before England and Wales introduced same-sex marriage, it was necessary for married trans people to end their marriages for the trans person to gain legal gender recognition. Some couples in this situation did not wish to end their marriages, so the transitioning person did not apply for legal recognition. Others felt compelled to end their marriages and then contract new ones after gender recognition had been granted, which they described as like having their marriages stolen. Thankfully, this is no longer the case. However, instead, when a married trans person seeks gender recognition, their spouse must give permission. Current legislation maintains that the spouse is only consenting to the continuation of the marriage. In practice, they actually have the power to consent or not to their partner's gender being legally recognised. If the spouse's permission is withheld, then the trans person is blocked from having their gender legally recognised. The marriage continues to exist. After gender recognition is granted, either party has 6 months to end the marriage. However, there is a loophole. Before the marriage, Same-Sex Couples Act 2013 came into effect, married trans people could only receive an interim gender recognition certificate, or IGRC, which is merely a document stating that a GRC can be provided to the applicant if they divorce. The IGRC allows a swift annulment of marriage, but only if the application is made within 6 months of receipt of the IGRC. If divorce proceedings have already been initiated, an IGRC cannot be used to end a marriage. This allows a spouse to draw the matter out for years. During that time, the trans person does not have legal gender recognition, and this can stop them applying for jobs or acquiring property.
British police are the best in the world. I don't believe one of these stories I've heard about them raiding gay bars for no reason at all, lining the customers up by the wall, picking out people, knocking them down, resisting arrest as they're kicked on the ground, searching their houses and calling them queer. I don't believe that sort of thing happens here.
Children are often used as a stick with which to beat marginalised people. Usually it'll be in the way of telling rich white cis suburban people that they're coming for your kids or some nonsense. This is probably most obviously demonstrated by this KKK poster, which suggests that if you don't burn a cross on your front lawn and lynch black people, your teenage daughter could, maybe make out with a black kid. Likewise, such was the fear that gay people could indoctrinate young minds, turn them gay or some shit, that Section 28 exists in the first place, summarised by that infamous Maggie Thatcher speech.
But it's the plight of individual boys and girls which worries me most. Too often, our children don't get the education they need, the education they deserve. And in the inner cities, where youngsters must have a decent education if they are to have a better future, that opportunity is all too often snatched from them by hard left education authorities and extremist teachers. And children who need to be able to count and multiply are learning anti-racist mathematics, whatever that may be. Children who need to be able to express themselves in clear English are being taught political slogans. Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
When Stonewall was campaigning to oppose Section 28, we were often told that young lesbian, gay and bi people are impressionable, vulnerable and don't understand themselves. Today we know this simply isn't the case, and thankfully it's something we hear far less often, so we can't let history repeat itself and a rollback of existing rights happen because the same arguments are now being made about trans people. You can even see this in things like Drag Queen Story Hour, which technically isn't anything to do with transness, but again, the idea that someone can bend or exaggerate gender norms and expectations and be near kids is just anathema to some of these people, and again exposes their latent homophobia. They view drag queens, who are primarily cis gay men, as tantamount to trans women who, in their minds, are violent sexual predators in waiting, just because some dudes wanted to dress up and read books to children. As I brought up earlier, there's a prevailing idea that a trans person will in some way indoctrinate kids into being trans, just like the people who supported Section 28 in the first place believed that gays would. Even ignoring that side of it though, there is actual evidence to suggest that trans people are much more likely to be the victims of sexual assault rather than perpetrators, but this trope of the perverted man who wants to attack and harm women and children just never seems to go away, though now it's being tacked onto trans women rather than gay men. The sentiment never changed, just the target. And as previously mentioned, transphobes, and especially TERFs, will claim that trans men are just women who've been pushed or forced into transitioning by an insidious agenda and or conspiracy of all-powerful trans people who apparently run society from the shadows but also simultaneously didn't bother to give themselves equal rights. Like, for example, J.K. Rowling, who said of trans men, "I'm concerned about the huge explosion in young women wishing to transition. Most people probably aren't aware, I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, that 10 years ago the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now reversed. In 2018, American physician and researcher Lisa Littman set out to explore it. In an interview she said, parents online were describing a very unusual pattern of transgender identification, where multiple friends and even entire friend groups became transgender identified at the same time. I would have been remiss had I not considered social contagion and peer influences as potential factors." Littman mentioned Tumblr, Reddit, Instagram and YouTube as contributing factors to rapid onset gender dysphoria, where she believes that in the realm of transgender identification, youth have created particularly insular echo chambers. Lisa Littman had dared challenged one of the central tenets of trans activism, which is that a person's gender identity is innate like sexual orientation. Nobody, the activists insisted, could ever be persuaded into being trans. Which, I mean, really, how different exactly is that kind of rhetoric from people defending Section 28 saying shit like this? One has only to look through the entire animal world to realise that it is abnormal. In any case, the clause, as it stands, does not prohibit homosexuality in any form, it merely discourages the teaching of it. When one is young at school, one is very impressionable and may just as easily pick up bad habits as good habits. Not to mention the weirdness surrounding the age of medical consent for trans people very closely mirroring the age of sexual consent debate for LGBT people. For those who are unaware, after homosexuality was legalised in the UK, the age of consent for a gay person was 21, and anyone under that age could be arrested and persecuted for having sex that would be totally above board for a straight person. Over the years, this was lowered to 18 and then finally to 16 in line with the UK age of consent for heterosexual people. The reason for this was quite simply that people didn't believe that young gay men were aware of themselves and their sexual existence until they were much older than straight people, and who knows, maybe they'll decide to be straight if they can't fuck other dudes. Oh, and also it carried with it the suspicion that gay men might coerce or assault younger boys, because there's this pervasive myth of the gay pedo going around, so if the age of consent was kept high, it meant that young boys couldn't be forced into sex with older men. The same concern was not there for heterosexual sexual encounters, even though obviously it's far more common that way around. A similar thing is going on right now in the medical field. Trans teens, transphobes and the government contend, should not have the ability to start taking cross-sex hormones until they are significantly older than the current age of medical consent, because what if they change their mind? The evidence doesn't support this, by the way, with detransitions making up less than 1% of people who transition, often only detransition due to pressure from family or society, and of course trans people are already only 1% of the population. 1% of 1%. All the evidence points to the simple fact that young people should have the same bodily autonomy when it comes to transition as, for example, abortion or tattoos or cosmetic surgery or whatever other routine surgery they require, and realistically there's no real reason one would want to stop transitions but be totally okay with teenagers getting a tattoo or something, right? Unless there was some other reason for wanting to stop trans people being able to have the same rights as everyone else, of course.
So try and sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way.
One thing you'll see consistently when having an argument with transphobes online is this constant victim complex. We're not oppressing trans people because we hate them, the argument goes, we're just concerned for our safety and that of our children. Anyone who is aware of the political discourse around gay marriage will remember this as a retooled version of the "how will I explain this to my kid" narrative, or the previously mentioned tactic of accusing anyone you don't like of being a pedo, even though transphobes literally want someone to look at kids' genitals before they're allowed to piss. And I don't want to repeat myself too much, but transphobes are big fans of using other vulnerable groups, for example women or gay people, in order to oppress trans people, whilst claiming that actually they are the true victims of trans people demanding rights and respect. And then there's the whole eroding what it means to be a woman thing. Incidentally, you'll never find a TERF who's able to give a definition of woman that includes all cis people and excludes all trans people without ignoring the existence of intersex people, because as it turns out, gender is really quite complex when it comes down to it. Anyway, this tactic you may recognise as the eroding the sanctity of marriage argument. We could do this for ages, like for example J.K. Rowling's saying that she empathised with trans victims of violence, but then went on to imply that allowing them to use women's spaces would endanger cis women in some way, which of course isn't really all that different from people in the 80s saying, I don't support gay bashing, but I don't want gay teachers in my kid's school. As it turns out, not all prejudice and discrimination is as straightforward as direct violence targeted against a specific group, and is much more subtle but insidious. Many proponents of Section 28 weren't kicking the teeth in of every gay man they saw, but they were causing them demonstrable harm by raising concerns about the potential ramifications of gay rights. And hence, through this convoluted logic, you end up with people like Posey Parker advocating for armed guards being posted in women's toilets to dissuade a trans woman from choosing to piss there. But they're not bigots, obviously.
Had a bit of an idea about some of the things that you can do. And men, for once, I'm talking to you. I'm talking about you dads who maybe carry, I think that's what you say. I'm so down with the American lingo. Maybe you carry, maybe you don't. Maybe you consider yourself a protector of women. Maybe you're that sort of man. Maybe you have a daughter or a mother or a wife. Maybe you have a sister. Maybe you just have some friends. Maybe you just think women are human and you don't need any absolute connection with them to feel compelled to protect us. I think you should start using women's toilets, men.
But how did TERFs get this victim narrative? Why should they repeat the same talking points that were used to oppress gay people, who they claim to care about, in the not too distant past? Well, there's a number of reasons, one being that it's easy to justify cruelty if you can successfully argue that you're an innocent victim defending yourself from a horde of crazed degenerates, but a big part of it is because, well, they've learned from their allies, and oh boy, they certainly keep interesting friends for a group that claims to care about, for example, women's and gay rights, because due to their pretty extreme views, TERFs have often found themselves allying with the extreme right in order to achieve their goals. The Heritage Foundation, an influential ultra-conservative think tank that denies the scientific consensus on climate change and has been virulently homophobic for decades, for example, helps fund the LGB Alliance, and TERF groups like WOLF, Women's Liberation Front, have spoken on panels hosted by the Heritage Foundation. Time and again, you'll see people like Women's Place UK, for example, on the same side of the argument as the Christian Institute, because ultimately they don't actually care about women's or gay rights, or at least not as much as they care about harming trans people, and they don't care if that aligns them with the sort of people who would ban gay marriage and abortion if they had any amount of power or influence. Just like the concerned mothers, who were very liberal, extremely open-minded and so on, but just didn't want their kids to learn about gay people or that sort of degeneracy, so ended up allying with the Salvation Army and National Front.
To be gay, sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. One more time. Sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy that way. Hey, sing if you're glad to be gay. Sing if you're happy this way.
Oh boy, let's talk about conversion therapy, I guess, because, hey, guess what? It's coming back into fashion, but again, to be used against trans people rather than gay people. Are you seeing a pattern here? Look, I probably don't need to go into too much detail about conversion therapy because it's generally understood that it's bad and we should ban it. Although, just a quick aside, J.K. Rowling's pseudonym, Robert Galbraith, just so happens to be very similar to Robert Galbraith Heath, the guy who pioneered gay conversion therapy, so that's fun. Anyway, you almost certainly know what conversion therapy is. It's a barbaric practice that exists to try to turn, for example, gay people, straight, trans people, cis, etc., has been thoroughly unsuccessful and has been correctly identified as both a hate crime and a form of torture in much of the world. And yet, here we are. Conversion therapy is still technically legal in the UK, and as a result, according to Stonewall, 1 in 20 British LGBTQ+ people have been pressured to undergo conversion therapy, whether that be through the guise of gender-critical therapy or something else, while getting healthcare rising to 1 in 5 among transgender people. In fact, Stonewall's report quoted a 19-year-old trans man recounting his experiences. After a suicide attempt, the nurse said that my mental health problems were due to allowing Satan in my soul. If I just accepted my true gender, then God could forgive me. Conversion therapy still exists, though these days it's more focused on gender than sexuality, and pretty much always will exist so long as it's legal. And the public believes that LGBTQ+ identity is not innate or is some kind of mental health issue or deviation that can be corrected with enough therapy. There are therapists in the UK that specialise in this kind of shit, claiming to help kids fit better with their correct gender, and no amount of whitewashing and calling them gender-critical mental health professionals will change that, and neither will sowing a bunch of Twitter randos, Graham. The government has dragged its feet over banning it, incidentally, so I have no real choice other than to assume that they support it, or at the very least don't see it as a real problem. Over the past 3 years, hundreds of parents whose children have come out to them as transgender or gender non-conforming have turned to the Gender Critical Support Board. Founded in 2017, for parents and families by parents and families who share the experience of coping with a child, teenager, or young adult who believes he or she is transgender, the online comment board has thousands of posts from parents who are desperate for help, but many of these parents aren't looking for trans-affirming care. Just look at a sample of some posts. I need a therapist for my male-identified daughter who won't just affirm without any questions. We are desperate, thank you. Glad you found a great therapist. I have yet to find one non-affirming therapist. Seeking non-affirming therapist in my area. It might be a good idea to start researching therapists so you have a go-to plan if it ever comes to that. You'll find that a lot of people in the medical and therapy fields are affirming, and that's the last thing you want. So cultivate a list, if you can, of non-affirming therapists and doctors. Some parents on the Gender Critical Support Board may be seeking what would view as conversion therapists for their children, licensed mental health care workers, who in the parents' words won't just affirm their gender identity without any questions. These parents don't view non-affirming therapists as conversion therapists, but the connections are clear. Gender Critical Theory is the newest cover of a song that's been playing for the past 50 years.
You don't have to be gay to sing on this chorus, but it helps.
I think you get the point now, at least you should. There's a reason the T exists in LGBT, and it's not because these groups all necessarily have the same goals and ideals, but because they all share the same struggles. What affects one of us will eventually come around to affect the rest of us. You don't need to look much further than Gender Critical Twitter to see this, by the way. As recently as just a couple of days ago, at time of recording, a prominent TERF made the direct comparison between Owen Jones, a cis gay man, and Gary Glitter, an infamous child molester, simply because he publicly supported trans rights, thus reviving decades-old stereotypes about gay men being into young boys. Likewise, all the chuntering and fear-mongering over single-sex spaces, implications that trans people are in some way a potential danger to cis people and so on, are really no different from similar misinformed ideas about gay people in the 80s and 90s, backs against the wall lads and all that. It's just recycled homophobia, often funded by the same people who were pushing homophobia until very recently. Nothing more or less. We're all aware of the fucking weird way transphobes talk about trans healthcare and the existence of trans people in general. If not, you really don't need to look further than the recent furore over the Gender Recognition Act, in which the experts all came together and agreed, based on available evidence, that trans people were valid, transition is good, puberty blockers are fine and have been used for decades without significant negative impact to society, and that trans people should have the same rights of bodily autonomy and medical consent as everyone else, but the transphobes just ignore that, I guess, because it's convenient. Weird weird considering how much they claim to care about what they reckon biology is, incorrectly of course, and exactly how is this any different to the stuff around AIDS in the 80s and the age of consent disparities? The rhetoric around trans people and trans ideology being taught in schools is really very on the nose because it's literally Section 28. No teaching of trans people as valid or transness as a legitimate way to live versus no promoting the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. The idea is the same. Transness, just like LGBT sexuality, isn't innate or anything, it's just taught to kids as acceptable, so they're tricked into thinking they're gay or trans. So let's bring back fucking conversion therapy, I guess, and pray the gay away or whatever. There is a reason we in the LGBTQ plus community banded together, and that is because we have a common cause. The first brick at Stonewall was likely thrown by a trans woman, and trans people have been an essential part of this movement since its inception. We cannot allow blind bigotry, manufactured prejudice, or right-wing gutter press to convince us to help oppress trans people. Trans people are our siblings in arms, our comrades, and our allies. We must remember the harm and the pain caused by Section 28 and its like, and we must remember that legacy. We cannot allow that to be inflicted on anyone else, and especially other members of our community. If you're against hate or bigotry or homophobia, if you're opposed or are disgusted by Section 28 and its legacy, I beg of you, please stand with me and with our trans comrades and resist this attempt to revive it. Do not let the brutal history of LGBT oppression repeat itself. Trans liberation now.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
Hello everyone. So that was quite an intense one, wasn't it? Usually I say I hope you enjoyed it, but honestly, I don't think this was a particularly enjoyable video. I think it's important, which is why I was so eager to put it out sooner rather than later. And this is something that I am passionate about. And, you know, the idea of Turf Island or whatever is a sort of meme, a joke that goes around the internet. But the situation is very serious and very dire. The state of trans rights in the UK is abysmal and needs to be fought against. In fact, it's so bad that me and one of my friends, who is a trans guy, have started looking into IRL organising in order to actively resist it. Many of my friends are trans, my partner is trans, and the situation in the UK right now is terrifying, and as someone who's, I guess you could say, a student of history, extremely reminiscent of the history we thought would never repeat. Things are going to get worse before they get better. Things will get better, but it may take a while, and in the meantime I'm going to try and do everything I can in real life to stop that happening. To help the trans people who are suffering and dying based on their gender identity, just like people like me would have been based on our sexuality just a few decades ago. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. This video is possibly one of the most important that I've ever made in my opinion, and this issue is incredibly important. Please, if you can, donate to trans charities and organisations in the UK that are fighting against and resisting the genuinely disgusting status quo of trans rights in the UK right now. Additionally, I just want any of my British viewers to be aware there is a potential bathroom bill that may be brought into law in the UK. Now currently, the government has put out for a call to evidence for and against. In the description and pinned comment of this video, there is a link to a Reddit post that has all of the information and how to resist it. Essentially, all it requires is that you just send an email template as an email to a government email address, essentially saying that you oppose this idea and that you don't want the government to have any influence over who gets to use what toilets. If you're not in the UK, please share it as much as possible, but obviously you can't really email into the email address because your views won't be counted as a non-British person. Now you're able to do that up until 11:45 PM on the 26th of February, so I'm going to try and get this out as quickly as possible. Hopefully there should be a couple of weeks or maybe a week and a half, depending on how long editing takes, for you to do that. I beg of you, if you don't take anything else from this video, please do that. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next one, which hopefully should be a little bit more cheerful. Bye!